Hi, my name is Michael Waitze, and welcome to the Asia Tech Podcast. Across Asia Pacific, enterprise artificial intelligence has reached a critical paradox. Capital investment in AI is soaring, yet nearly three-quarters of organizations are deploying models on fragmented, ungoverned data infrastructures, creating massive operational friction, unchecked tool sprawl, and invisible failure points. Businesses are spending millions of dollars to accelerate intelligence, only to discover their underlying technology stack may not adequately support their ambitions. And in this episode of the Asia Tech Podcast, we invest the architectural reality behind the hype, drawing from the Omdia research report commissioned by Boomi, AI ambition meets data reality, APEC technology priorities and challenges, and some of the key questions. Why are enterprise executive teams aggressively funding AI deployments before securing the integration architectures required to sustain them? Does unmanaged tool sprawl erode model accuracy and enterprise ROI? And what operational guardrails should IT leaders put in place to bridge the massive gap between governance strategy and real-world execution? And joining us today to unpack all of this and discuss all of these important topics are Michael Barnes, the chief analyst at Omdia, and David Arecki, the CTO APJ at Boomi. Gentlemen, how are you guys doing today?
Very good, thanks.
Very well. Thanks, Michael. How are you, mate?
I am super duper. It's great to have you both here. Okay, let's just jump right into this thing. The research report that I just referenced shows that 74% of APJ enterprises are actively running AI initiatives, yet fewer than half have an integration platform strategy at scale. Why are executive teams committing capital to AI deployments before securing the architectural foundation required to support them? And Michael, let's start with you.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's a totally valid question, Michael, but I guess you have to think about this. And David, you've been in the industry as long as I have. In one sense, AI isn't really any different than any other massive tech initiative. If you think about it, folks basically never start with the foundational infrastructure or platform or architecture for a new technology, whatever it is. They start by understanding the potential value proposition, right? And then they look for an opportunity to do some kind of limited scope proof of concept to validate what they think it might do for them. And then if that's successful, they consider some issues, things like data privacy, for instance, maybe employee usage guidelines, things like that. But then they still have to actually roll it out to something that is viable, that's beyond a proof of concept. That's right. Generally the point where they think about governance and management and architecture and infrastructure and all these enterprise wide considerations. They don't start with that because first they have to validate the technology and find some areas where they're actually delivering something measurable in terms of benefits.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because if you back it up a little bit, you could almost go back a year, even 2.5 years, where boards and C-suites were almost acting like a central bank, just printing money for these AI initiatives. And then now, to Michael's point, they've reached that stage where that definitely might have made sense in a pilot where there was a small little use case focused on a specific set of data. But as they go to scale that out, they start looking at it and going, well, one, my foundations are not ready to scale that out, or two, the cost is well beyond what we were thinking.
So this is actually really important. I'm glad you brought this up. There's this cost perspective, right? And I love this idea of a set. I love when people come up with great analogies, by the way. So keep doing that. But in a way, some of these C-suites and the boards were acting like central banks. They're just like, how much more money can we print, and to whom do we give it? If anybody wants it, please take it. And then they did kind of put their hands up and say, whoa, this is getting a little bit more expensive than I thought it was going to be. Famously, like one of the biggest, I think it was the CTO or the CFO from a large ride-hailing company, which we don't need to mention, came out and was like, we just spent our whole budget. It's only April. Now what do we do? Right? So
yeah, I remember that article.
Right? I mean, but once that type of thing happens, how do then you rein it back in and then decide, after doing a bunch of tests, a bunch of experiments, and a bunch of like proof of concepts, and maybe David, you can comment on this first, but then where do you decide, like, okay, now we need to spend this money in a way that makes more sense, where we can understand what our ROI is? Then where do you go? How do you decide that?
Yeah, I think it's back to the framework Michael said around that foundation. The organizations are trying to understand, well, what systems do they have? What processes are they trying to either automate or reimagine with AI? Because we're noticing a pattern that just dropping AI into an existing process might give you that 5 to 10% efficiency, but it doesn't really move the needle that much.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of businesses looking at how do we re-platform, for lack of a better word, but having that underlying data platform, to Michael's point. So that's really key. I don't know, Michael, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, and you can think about it from a bunch of different ways, right? I mean, when it comes to AI, I suppose the way I think about it, and come back to your point, why were companies acting like central banks and just handing out money hand over fist for these projects? It was this irrational exuberance in this kind of sense. It was really kind of fear of missing out, right?
Yeah.
It was this sense, this hype. My God, we have to do this. It's going to change everything. And then after spending all the money, the question is, well, wait, what are we doing again? And why are we doing it? And where's the actual value in this? And so then if you take a step back, right, and you think about, okay, where is the potential value? You identify some particularly strategic business functions or whatnot. And that's where maybe you target the AI initiatives. But that's the point where you're like, oh, wait a minute. If we're going to do that, these are core processes, right? These are mission critical. We need an infrastructure for this. We can't try to treat it as a proof of concept or treat it as a experimentation. This is real business now. So it's this weird, we've talked about this, David, this kind of contradiction, right? Folks know they need to deliver value, but they're setting themselves up for even more serious heartbreak because they don't have the infrastructure in place to actually be confident they can deliver on that value.
Yeah, but that comes back to the use case again, exactly what you're talking about,
100%.
Michael, because, those use cases are very specific to what can and can't be done with AI, because to your point, if they're not set up and ready, they're not going to deliver those outcomes. And so, but it's not just about the underlying data infrastructure. We're starting to see people look at, well, these small little pilots might actually be delivering a return for an individual line of business or a user. And so that is actually staying in some organizations, and that is turning into shadow AI. And that's something that's going to have to be governed and managed as well.
Can I ask you guys this, if you don't mind? Has the pressure point changed? Again, if we were having this conversation like 3 or 4 months ago, we would have definitely said that, like, from the C-suite down through the board, if they went out to dinner with their friends, they literally would have had a conversation with something like this. Hey, what are you guys doing in AI? We're like, well, nothing yet. Oh, I better get back to work and actually put pressure on my senior management team to actually get anything done. Has that changed, do you think, over time? Where now, as Michael was suggesting, that there are specific places where value has been identified? Can we generalize about whether the pressure point has changed a little bit, where maybe it's now bottom up and not top down, where people are saying we need to have this to get these things done inside of the value chain? And the second place is, can you generalize a little bit about the specific places where AI can actually be helpful and add value? Either one of you can go first.
There's a ton to unpack there, so I'm going to forget half.
Yeah. No, it's okay. I'll come back to it. I just have these complex thoughts, and I just want to get them out there before I forget. Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's all valid. It's all valid. I would say this: it's a mix, as it kind of always is. On the one hand, like any other kind of IT initiative, right? Folks have learned over the past couple of years, so there's far more understanding about where AI makes sense, at least near term, and maybe where it might make sense longer term. So there's that. The flip side, though, is this space is moving so insanely fast relative to really any other initiative that we can think of. So while on one hand, as I mentioned up front, it's kind of similar to everything we've done before, in another sense, it's completely different. And that's down, I'd say, to just the pace of change. So, but to answer the question, Michael, yes, I think what we've seen is an increased sophistication around the different types of AI, which we haven't talked about. We can touch on that, and the potential value that they can provide, right? So, for instance, what we've seen, a lot of the early benefits weren't from explicit AI projects per se. It's from leveraging AI that's embedded in other systems. So in my business applications, if I'm a big SAP shop or Workday or Salesforce or whoever, they are baking AI into those capabilities. If I'm, using Microsoft, I've got Copilot, for instance, to help with employee productivity. Those are all proof of concepts, right? They're all validating the technology. But then we have agentic AI, and this comes to really, what David's focused on, which actually becomes long-running processes that are complex and go beyond the bounds of any individual application or system or potentially even use case. That's where things get both potentially incredibly interesting, transformative, but also highlight and just scream out the need for better integration and a thought out strategy for integration between data and processes.
Yeah, but Mike, I'd almost position it as well. If you kind of wind the clock back to 2024, it was a lot of generative use cases. So, summarization of data, and those use cases made sense at that time. You asked a question, you got a response. You didn't have these semi-sensationalized stories of AI escaping the lab, where on that point you do now, because agents have a lot more autonomy. And you want them to be semi-autonomous. You want them to be working in the background 24/7, signing off your expenses or doing different things in the background. And that's the balance we have to do now. So that's definitely one thing. And the other thing I think is back to the cost discussion is the CFOs have definitely started looking at the budget and the balance books and going, why are we signing off? Exactly to your point, Michael, around that rideshare use case. Why are we signing off on that kind of dollar amount? Because it was really interesting. I was having a conversation a few weeks ago with a business that was actually saying for some of the tasks, the human is actually cheaper.
Yeah,
hence you get some of that rehiring. Yeah.
Have we underestimated, and I say we as like a holistic we, right? Have we underestimated just the pure cost of agentic AI, where it feels like it should be free, but or very low cost, right? Because we don't have to pay the guy's insurance, his kid, he never takes vacation kind of thing. And yet at the end of the day, there's all this other infrastructure that's around it that makes it, I wouldn't say more expensive always, but definitely more expensive than we considered. Is that fair?
I think it's as the technology evolved, it's a different scope. Because again, you go back to something like maybe ChatGPT 2.0. I remember reading a stat that it only took something like $50,000 of infrastructure cost to actually do the training. And when you're going to the latest models, you're talking over $1 billion just because of the amount of information and inference they're processing. But just on this cost topic, it's interesting. In probably the last 3-4 weeks, a lot of the conversations I've been having, businesses are trying to understand where it makes sense. Exactly to Michael's point, what model do I use? So if the task is really complex, yes, we'll keep using the frontier models. But if the task is simple, couldn't we use some of these open source models that are coming out onto the market that we can just run on premise? They might be doing a few dodgy things on their own to train themselves up, but they're providing results nearly as good as the frontier models.
Michael, what do you think? Because I've got a follow-up, but I want you to comment first, and then I want to follow up on that, if you don't mind.
Oh, 100%. I mean, there's no question that, it's moving incredibly quickly, but our understanding of the potential and the technology's current ability to deliver on the potential, there's a bit of a mismatch there. Sure, there's certainly some wishful thinking involved when it comes to agentic in particular.
Can I ask you guys this? So I think, David, the one thing you're referencing is, right, some of the, let's just put it in air quotes, like the dodgy stuff or the interesting stuff that some of the open weight models have been doing. I think you were referring to this distillation, right? It's just creating tons of accounts, going back and understanding, distilling what these big models are doing, and then implementing back into their own models. And because they're open weight, it means you can download them. And they're not free, but the cost per million, both for input and output, is just so much lower. In some cases, 6 times lower. In some cases, 10 times lower. But can we make the case as well? There was a very, very famous interview with Steve Jobs and Gates, where Jobs was like, look, one of the things that we know about Microsoft is they simply have no taste, and all they do is get their photocopiers running whenever we put out a new operating system. It's not distillation per se, But this kind of thing has been going on forever. Is it just because it's geopolitically sensitive that you think that this is coming out, or is there some other reason why you think this is becoming so important? Because this is not new to me at any level.
No, it's interesting what the real reason is behind the scenes, but the way I look at it and think of it is there's only so much information in the world. And I was reading a
Yeah,
great
exactly.
article on the plane to Singapore yesterday where a lot of the model providers they've run out of things to train on the internet because
Yeah,
that's where
I
they
think I was reading
started.
the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and so they're buying books now, cutting the spines and then scanning them. And there's a huge side market now in picking up rare text that nobody's embedded in. But eventually, all of these models are going to be trained on the same data.
Yeah.
And the performance statistics between them is going to vary very minutely. And so that's what I like the idea of where enterprises are thinking now about how they split their workloads. Because if you think you can bring some of those models on premise, you can essentially create a moat. You add your context to those models around your business, that becomes your competitive edge. And you own that IP rather than helping train the frontier models to take over essentially what you do as a business.
Yeah. Michael, what do you think?
Yeah, look, I mean, I agree with everything that we're saying. I will throw a spanner in the works, though, because what we're
Go ahead.
talking about, it's a technology discussion. I get it. But where organizations are struggling, and I think actually where this industry is, potentially going to see some hiccups, is the other side of the equation, which is the actual outcomes, the business outcomes. We can talk
Go
about the
ahead.
tech all day, and again, it's critically important. It's interesting as well, and it's moving so
Mm.
quickly that it's kind of hard to look away. The flip side, though, is organizations haven't been particularly good at clearly identifying the outcomes based on the investments they are making, based on the capabilities they have. It's one thing to choose between different models and kind of choose the correct tool for the correct problem, but folks aren't very good at identifying the problem. They're still
Yes.
focused on the
Yeah, that's
technology.
fair.
That to me is a huge issue.
So can we get back to data for a second here? Because this is one of the things we wanted to cover as well. When they build this stuff on data, first of all, that everybody else is using, the outcomes will end up actually being generically pretty similar, even though I
Yep.
understand that these models are not deterministic, they're probabilistic. So you end up with different outcomes, maybe potentially along the way, depending upon how you're using the models. But at some level, even when the LLMs themselves give you kind of different answers, they kind of rhyme with each other, if that makes sense. How do we get to
Right.
a point where big enterprises that want to have good outcomes, as you suggest, are using their own internal proprietary data to run stuff through an artificial intelligence model, whether it's an LLM or some new kind of model, so that then they can get a very specific and non-generic outcome that's better for their outcomes?
Correct. And that's the context discussion.
Yeah.
To Michael's point, if they have that data layer, they've connected the right systems together, so they have good data liquidity, they have good data quality across that data, they pick the right use case to provide the right outcome, to Michael's point, then all of that together becomes that wrapper around that model, and that's the context, that's the moat.
Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. And then how do we get there?
Yeah.
Realistically, as I said, to me, it comes back to a better, maybe clearer understanding of actual outcomes, right? And we're guilty of this. I think we actually talked about it a few minutes ago. You can leverage Gen AI and the original promise. Oh, we can increase productivity. So what? What does that lead
Exactly.
to? No, honestly, so people can cut some of their mundane tasks out of the day to day. What do we then have them do to add value for the organization? And companies
Right.
don't really, they're not particularly good at having that discussion, because it's much easier to talk about the tech than it is to actually understand how people's jobs actually change. Probably the best example of where we've had some success, if you think about customer service, right? I think it's easier to empower customer service agents with more intelligence in order to better serve the folks they're engaging with, if they're
Mm.
engaging with them at all. It could be a AI-enabled chatbot, but in many instances, it still won't be. That makes sense because those folks are up against it, and so every kind of minute that they can use to be more, I guess, responsive and insightful about what they're doing and how they're engaging with customers, the better off that experience will be for the customer. But in most instances, if we're talking about admin work, white collar professionals who have the ability through AI to do some mundane tasks, to automate some stuff. Again, so what? How are we measuring whether that actually leads to more value for the company or not? I don't think right now we do particularly well, to be honest.
David, can I just give an example? And David, you may have heard this in one of the conversations we've already had, but Michael, I want to make sure that you understand my perspective on this as well, because I do think this workflow and the outcome thing really matters. So let me give you my own personal example, if you don't mind. I was a sales trader on a portfolio trading desk at Goldman Sachs when we implemented automated trading, so algorithmic trading. My job trained drastically because before that I was trading literally, like, let's say on the trading desk we did 300, 400, maybe $500 million of business a day. And it was hard to do because it was all manual. We had to coordinate stuff. If we went to cross trades, it was really hard too. And once we implemented artificial intelligence through agentic trading, we then could do 10 times more business, lower our prices, but still make way more money. But as you suggested, our customer service improved drastically because now we had time to do things that we never had time to do before. And to be fair, none of us got fired at all. Like it was scary actually at the beginning when we started doing algorithmic trading, because it was like, well, then what are we going to do? But what we did do was what you suggested, which was really interact with our clients and make them feel like they were actually involved in what was happening. And when we needed to tweak the thing that the AI was doing, we could do that easily because we had the time and because our minds were free enough to say, like, let's just say 90% of what was going on was automated, but the other 10% was where we added value, and it made a really big difference. Sorry, please go ahead.
No, I mean, that makes total sense. The thought that was going into my head is actually a lot of what we do with our partners at the moment, because our partners, exactly on that same vein, when they're looking to implement a capability like Boomi or other capabilities,
right.
These products are now popping in as plugins to like Claude Code or Codex or other platforms. So to your point, our partners are able to deliver more with less, but that less, yes, they might be passing a cost saving on, but that allows them to think better. Back to Michael's point around the architecture, how do we handle errors? Now that we've done this, it actually enables us to do this, and we can actually add that on because we have the time. So there's much more scope around value and outcomes than there was before.
Yeah. Michael, maybe you can address this for me as well, right? One of the things that I think about a lot, and we've mentioned this before, is that we mentioned this at the beginning, sorry, is that people start doing the pilots and then they start thinking about the back end and particularly the data infrastructure as well. Again, just an anecdote. I remember in the 90s, a very famous comedian, and you guys are probably too young to remember this, but said, if you promise me that a CD player is the last thing that's going to be invented for music, I'll buy one. Right, I'll buy, because now it's a cassette deck, now it's whatever it is. But if you promise me the CD thing, I'll replace my collection, I'll buy all the CDs, but just tell me it's the last possible one. And the only reason why I bring this up is because back then stuff was moving pretty quickly too. But this data layer, and we can spend as much time on this as both of you want, but this data layer actually ends up being really important, right? Because if you have to go back and look at your infrastructure at scale, and you have these sort of disaggregated or fragmented data layers across the board, both internally and externally, because now you're getting agents coming from the outside too. You're going to have to go through and do all this realignment of a lot of your tech stack to make sure that it works now with the AI stuff that you're doing. But are we at a point now where businesses are getting like, I just did the cloud, you talked to me about the metaverse, is Web3 involved? Like, all these things are going on at once, and then AI hits. Is there a little bit of sort of tiresome feeling around this? Like, just please tell me this is the last thing I have to do to get my stuff in order. Do you get that sense?
I look at if I look at the electronics retailers in Australia, LPs are making a comeback, and that's how I feel.
I want them all.
Yeah, but that's how I feel with integration. It's almost in a phase of renaissance that companies are now going, hey, we had these integration projects, we had these data projects going on for many years, but now it might be something we actually have to do seriously, where maybe that impetus wasn't there before. I don't know what you're thinking, Michael.
Oh, I will. Unfortunately, Michael. Well, one, you're certainly dating yourself and us as well, since we know exactly what you're talking about. But two, and this is important. Unfortunately, no. CDs aren't the end of the game, and neither is this
No,
data integration
Yeah.
discussion, because you didn't even
Yep.
mention the next big focus area, which is data sovereignty, where it's not only who has access to that data or how to integrate it, it's where is it being stored, where is it being
Right.
processed, how many different borders does it cross as part of an internal company process. We haven't even really discussed that point. That just adds a whole additional layer of complexity to this
We'll
discussion.
go through it a little bit, right? Because you do talk about this in the research that you've done. I don't want to go over the stats per se, but are enterprises misjudging? And again, I went through this. I when I was doing some sort of tech stuff when I was at Goldman Sachs, I ran across this thing where like all of our data was in the wrong place, and we were essentially violating the law in Korea. I've been through this
Right.
a few times,
Mm.
and I literally called my boss and I'm like, I don't care what else we do, but we've got to get data into Korea because it has to be sovereign, it has to be resident in Korea. But are people misunderstanding or underestimating the importance of that data sovereignty part of this thing? And how complex is that going to end up being in the context of all the stuff we're discussing?
Yeah, look, I'll give you my view, and then David certainly
Please.
chime in. I mean, it's a massive and insanely complex topic, because when we talk about sovereignty, data is just the kind of tip of the spear, right? Sovereignty involves lots of things, well beyond data, and well beyond compliance and
Yeah.
regulatory guidelines, right? We've got all these issues related to geopolitical uncertainty, access to various markets, and dealing with uncertainty at a global level in a way we really haven't in the past. People don't like uncertainty. So what you
No.
do in response, you try and exert some control. So in broad terms, sovereignty, digital sovereignty broadly, is a push towards increased control, whether it's from a nation state or from an organization. It's to try and control uncertainty wherever you can. The starting point is, I think, data, primarily because AI has exposed, to your point, the clear violations that are happening and the incredibly important, or let me say, the incredibly large risk of getting it wrong, because of AI exposes your data in a way that we've never done before.
Right.
So if you get it wrong, everyone's going to know.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly it, Michael, in that before we probably had a lot more control. You had to go to IT and get permission. Processes maybe were more manual based, et cetera, where now with agents and the level of autonomy they have, they can access data at the speed of light, no matter where it is. They can rock up to an MCP server and go, hey, what can you offer me? And the
Right.
MCP server goes, this is everything, go for it. And that's where the governance discussion becomes really, really important, because you've got to start thinking about what can the agents actually access? What can they do with it? What can they read, write, delete? And that is becoming a very heavy conversation. So it's interesting. We've been talking a lot around the data layer, the push to build agents, but the governance discussion is becoming quite a hot topic at the moment as well, to Michael's point.
I want to get to governance in a second, but I want to stay on the data thing and the data sovereignty thing, actually, because I think it is really complex, and I want to go a little bit deeper, if you don't mind. I would say in the old days that, like, when we started doing things that were off-prem, right? So cloud storage or cloud management or even cloud implementations of applications, most of the data that we were dealing with, at least for the most part, was actually internal data, right? So I was having my own particular cloud, at least in my case, having my own particular cloud instance. I was running stuff in the cloud, and the data that I was feeding into it was mostly external, unless I was getting market data from like the TSC or from the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Again, in my business, but now the LLMs, if you're using artificial intelligence, they're going out and getting data from everywhere, or at least they're using data from everywhere. Is there really a way to have digital sovereignty, as people are suggesting? And you've seen countries like France say, you know what, from now on, we're not going to use company A's technology anymore. We're going to build it ourselves internally. Yeah. But I feel like it's a bit of a red herring, in the sense that, how can you do this when everything, like the internet itself, is just a connectivity thing, right? How, when you're so connected, can you actually have real data sovereignty or real digital sovereignty at scale?
Right. Yeah, I mean, at the kind of macro level, it's a great point, Michael. I would say it's a spectrum, right? And there's
Yeah.
no
It has
way
to be.
that all but, you can a handful, single hand the number of organizations globally that would be completely sovereign, right? You can
Right.
have some sense of who, national intelligence organization as an example that would have to be potentially, right? On the other hand, and you have small companies, startups, any organization who's starting out completely in the cloud and leveraging a
Yeah.
hyperscale provider, no clue where their data is stored, and frankly, probably don't care because they're moving so quickly. It's all about leveraging the capability, and they want the benefits that come through that kind of globalization. Let's say they want the innovations that come from economies of scale that they get from those folks, right?
Right.
The more they go towards a sovereign approach, the more they're potentially trading off that access, that innovation, that economies of scale, and those potentially lower price points for increased control. But again, at what cost? Are there alternatives in region, or in the case of the French example, in the country that are credible enough? And if so,
Right.
what am I trading off? And what are the benefits? And this is when I come back to digital sovereignty is a great topic from an analyst standpoint because no one really fully understands it yet. So therefore, it's a rich vein of analysis and research. But that's ultimately what it comes down to. It's like everything else; it's a trade off.
Yeah, and look, at the end of the day, I was just thinking about I like analogies because I think it makes it easier for people to understand this stuff. It's like I want to grow my own tomatoes, but it's just way easier for me to go down to the supermarket and get a fresh tomato directly from a farmer. Do you know what I mean? And I know that tomatoes
Bang
are
on.
not the same as AI, but it's the same kind of concept of like I want to be as self-sustained as possible. But in a world that's so connected, it's almost impossible to do that. Sorry, David, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm just thinking back, regardless of the AI discussion, just thinking back to the old automation days. A lot of the companies I used to, when I was, pounding the street as a pre-sales engineer, we were almost talking about a bimodal business. You'd have a set of use cases that you could put in the cloud and the data could be resident somewhere else. And it's just accessing, SaaS-based CRMs or ERP or etc. But then you have
Yep.
another set of data, another set of use cases which are behind your firewall and they're protected in a way. So, for me, it's again almost a rehashing of some of those old discussions we've had, but probably
Yeah.
more to Michael's point, we're still trying to work a lot of that out for AI. What does it make sense because the technology is just moving so fast?
Do we consider the fact that, and Apple has come out and said this over the last couple of months too, right? They want to have, for security reasons or for differentiation reasons, right? They want to have, they're working on device AI, which today feels a little bit unthinkable just because of the massive amount of compute that's necessary to get this stuff done. But through compression, they've done some testing with compression and other sort of methodologies to get this done. How does that change the digital sovereignty thing if people are walking around with devices that they can use for their calculations or their questions around artificial intelligence?
Yeah, I mean, it just makes it even more complex, and the
Right?
challenges become potentially. It's hard to even extrapolate out how that gets managed. If I'm being
Mm.
honest, I mean, the good
Yeah.
news in that regard is that there is a lot of massive innovation happening around processing because right now, unfortunately, tech vendors, the AI vendors in particular, are essentially hoovering up all of the processing that's
Yeah.
available and making it difficult, right? So edge computing down to and including device level computing is necessary. Doesn't
Yeah.
answer your question, Michael. How do you manage that? That's a whole different kettle of fish, really.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to put it out there so people think about, so people can think about it, right? Like we don't have to have answers to the questions, but I think we need to ask the questions so people can sit down and think, sure, I'd love to have on-device artificial intelligence, but I also want to have data sovereignty, and I don't want to go down a security rabbit hole because we could. Well, let's do that on another show because I think we could spend hours just talking about the security side of this. But I just wanted to think about it out loud, if you don't mind. And David, if you have anything to add, please do.
Yeah, for me, it still keeps coming back to the use cases because in an enterprise, you've got your four walls. To an
Yep.
effect, you can try and gate what can be accessed and how you can use how employees are set up in their identity provider as a method, as an example, to have AI when they're asking a question, pull what data they can in and out. When you go outside of that box, yes, it's a hell of a lot harder. But then those consumers on their iPhones, are they spending 10% of their time accessing corporate data, and that can still be locked down and governed in some way.
Yep.
And the other 90% of the time are they asking questions around, which dress to buy, what restaurant to go to, book my flights, which, don't have that same level of risk.
Yeah, I will say this though. When I was at Goldman Sachs, I had my own iPhone, but they wouldn't let me use it for anything related to work. And I know the times have changed. The BlackBerry that they gave me, though, they managed directly, and this was one of the. I feel like Michael's laughing at me, but the BlackBerry that they gave me, he is laughing at me. But the BlackBerry that they gave me, they locked down, and I could only do very certain things on it. I presume like bring your own device now has changed all of that. Again, I told you at the beginning, it's been a while since I've had a corporate job, so I don't understand exactly how that's working today. But still, does that mean that companies are going to have to then get into the management of the personal devices as well? It feels a little off topic, but I'm just curious, like what you guys think about that.
Well, I mean, David nailed it. So, I mean, security, obviously, and again, this may be a topic for another day, but overall, so security has moved away from physical boundaries, right? And that kind of, protection by building bigger walls or a bigger moat towards a focus much more on identity. Right. And a zero trust architecture where it's very much focused on the access that's linked to your identity more than whatever device you're using. So there's certainly mechanisms and enough, I think, sophistication to help. But David, to your point, there's always going to be potential for human error, mishaps of some kind. Let's even put the nefarious actors aside. It's just people doing the wrong stuff inadvertently.
Yeah. And we've had plenty of use cases where, in the early days of generative AI, engineers were uploading schematics of, latest phone designs or things like that. And but this is something we've always had. It's just that AI widens that threat vector.
Can we talk about governance now? So I put it off for a moment just because I want to cover a couple of other things. But in the report, you do talk about this, right? 9 out of 10 organizations state that governance is a top priority. But not all of them actually have all of these policies enforced. How do you circle the square or square the circle around this gap between, like, we definitely know governance is important, but how do we actually implement it? And what should that governance be even?
Right. Yeah. I mean, look, the latter part is I think the key to the discussion. But it's interesting to me. I almost think initially it's like, well, so that means 10% of respondents basically said governance isn't important. I would, that sounds interesting to me because kind of if you ask the question, it's one of those questions people, of course it's important. Governance is critical, right? So I'm surprised that even there were 10% who said, it's not that important. But more importantly is then what does that mean in practice? And again, I think, back, David, to your point, folks figured out pretty early on that there are very clear risks here. And so we need usage guidelines for instance, the type of Gen AI tool you can access at work, the type of information you can upload, all of those kind of basic things, which maybe seemed common sense, but we make mistakes and we learn quickly. The broader issues around governance when it comes to, data governance and having that link to any type of integration strategy or frameworks, that's where it gets tricky because frankly, we've always, as organizations, been pretty bad at data governance. So AI doesn't change that. It only makes it more obvious and potentially risky.
Yeah, and to that point, I think there's many layers. You have governance at the integration layer, you have it at the data layer, you have it at the API or MCP layer to provide that connectivity into backend systems. And then to the flip side, some of the conversations around tables I've done recently, we have organizations that are starting on what does that risk profile look like? What procedures and processes do I need to build in, and taking it very, very slowly and almost letting the market blaze ahead and sort of trail then the design part for them to other organizations. I've been at round tables where they go, we'll build 500 agents and they're running around the organization. We have no idea who built them, what data they're accessing, how do we bring them in under control? So you've got both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say this. It always reminds me of the financial services regulators versus the innovation that we saw in the financial services space, where it was almost impossible for the regulators to keep up with stuff. Like, I don't think they knew what a CDO was, or as CDS was before somebody started like ruining the entire global economy. But I feel like this is the same internally. Are we running again into a risk where things are just moving so quickly that even if you created an entire team that was just set up for AI governance, and I want to dig a little bit deeper into the agentic stuff as well, that it's not impossible, but it's just going to be really hard to keep up, particularly because firms are way more interested in, again, what's the ROI? How does it add into the value chain? How does it help us make more money? How does it make us more productive, as opposed to what are the rules around using this?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you two views because I think the point about agentic and the pace of technology change, I think is spot on, Michael. And the analogy to regulars in financial services, I think makes perfect sense. But so table that for 1 minute though, because the other side of the equation, the, I guess, more mature side is around Gen AI, right? And governance of how that's being used within organization. And I would argue, I feel like certainly in all the discussions I have with organizations, and this is true in Australia, but certainly across the region and indeed globally as well, it comes back to that human challenge. Again, I mentioned that folks don't deal well with uncertainty, right? What's our response? We try and exert control and we get defensive. And that's what I'm seeing happening among employees in organizations that are pushing AI initiatives because they don't understand the implication for their jobs. Michael, I think you were in a good situation as a trader in that it was clear that you could add value, and pretty quickly you understood where to shift your focus. But a lot of folks in white collar, desk jobs don't have that clarity, and so the response is to kind of push back. So they're not necessarily receptive to a lot of the training and the education and the governance practices that companies would like to implement.
It's a really good point.
Technology.
Sorry, go ahead. It's a really, really good point. Did you want to keep going, or did I?
No, because I think so. That's the human issue, which I think is just worth mentioning. But then, and I'll let David talk to the agentic AI side of the house, where the just the pace of change is massive.
Yeah, it's a hard one because when we go back 2 or 3 years, there was a lot of 10 points to look out for kind of initiatives coming out of governments. But as we've moved on to today, we're starting to see, Singapore, Malaysia, the Philippines, Indonesia, etc., either staying down that route or going more towards the EU route where, there's consequences. And there's, a whole other discussion around, who owns that risk? Is it the model providers? Is it the businesses that actually implement the
guy that made the
processes?
All these things are fair.
Exactly. So there's so many angles to consider. And again, to Michael's point, I don't know if we'll ever capture all of these or be able to solve all of these, but it's a challenge we've consistently had over the years. All we can do is do our best to make sure, again, in the most critical use cases, where in healthcare and other areas, that doesn't lead to a poor outcome.
So can I just say this too? So I think it was Mark Benioff who said that this is the last generation of management teams that will be managing only humans. It may be a little bit of an exaggeration, but I think it's a fair way to frame like what's going on.
I think it's completely fair.
Yeah, I think it's completely fair too. But I just wanted to point out that like it's not just the three of us that are having this conversation. That like this idea of people are going, and I think I heard another statistic yesterday or the day before where someone said like for every human inside of a big organization, there are going to be 60 agents running around. Like that's a big difference, right? So if you have 100,000 or even a 50,000 person company, it's like having a 3 million person company now. There's just a lot more management energy is going to have to go into this. But one of the things you said, which I thought was interesting, is people don't deal well with uncertainty. Right? They don't like it at all. Markets don't deal well with uncertainty. They want some idea about what's coming, at least to have some choices. But agents don't even know about uncertainty. And I think that the thing that we talked about earlier, where you said like one of those agents kind of left the lab, this is the OpenAI Hugging Face example I think we were talking about. How do we deal with that? Do you know what I mean? Because here's the thing. This gets back to the governance conversation. Part of the reason why humans don't do things that are wrong, where they don't go off the reservation, is because they can get fired and then they have to go home to their wives or husbands and say like, why can't we eat next week? Or why can't Johnny go to summer camp? Like that's just a real thing. But the agents don't have that. They don't have kids, you know, they don't have partners. How do we square that one as well? Do you know what I mean? Because they don't understand uncertainty at all.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me, and this is a slight tangent. Before I answer, maybe I'm filibustering here as I'm thinking of how to answer that incredibly hard question.
Sorry about that.
It's amazing, though. You think about it. We're talking about governance. The governance challenges for Gen AI usage within an organization sounds almost quaint compared to the scenario you just laid out, as far as the governance issues and concerns and ramifications of getting it wrong when we're dealing with agents. It's a whole, exponentially larger potential challenge. And it's fascinating, we've moved that quickly from governance that almost seems, okay, that's manageable. We can do that, even though we're all pretty bad at it, as the data showed, or not doing enough of it. But agentic is a whole other kettle of fish. We haven't even really started to scratch the surface there as far as governance and management goes.
But I'd agree. It's a conversation that's only just really popped up in the last 6 months in seriousness.
Yeah, I mean, part of the interesting thing for me here is that, again, in the old days, I couldn't just like spin up any piece of software on my desk or on my computer that I wanted to. But once you give somebody the ability to create an agent right at the desk level, you're just introducing an entirely new way of working. Do you know what I mean? In the sense that, like, when I, again, this is years ago, maybe 25 years ago, like I was at Morgan Stanley and they were like, here's not Microsoft Excel, here's like Lotus 1, 2, 3. Again, please start laughing, Michael. But here's Lotus 1, 2, 3, and you can write macros in it. Okay, I was there. I'm not embarrassed about it. We wrote some pretty good macros in Lotus 1, 2, 3. But I wanted to have Microsoft Excel because I knew what the future was like. And I wanted to write macros in Visual Basic and then use that connectivity to connect to the back-end systems at Morgan Stanley to literally make my job way more productive. But I couldn't just like install Excel on my machine if I wanted to. It just wasn't possible. But today I get the sense that, like, if I want to spin up an agent and there's agentic infrastructure built into the company now that I can do that, how do we, I want to get the terminology right, like embed the right guardrails so that even if I create something that's not necessarily nefarious, that the system itself goes out and goes, you shouldn't be doing that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, from our perspective, and Michael touched on this as well, it's around that identity provider. That's one approach. If you're set up in an IDP with certain access controls, we can replicate those access controls in the agent as well. That's one approach.
Yeah.
Michael?
I'll come back. And Michael, I'm laughing only because I was there as well. I know exactly what you're saying.
I don't mind the laughing. I like it, actually. Yeah. Please go ahead.
But it's funny, but you raised a point that I think might be worth mentioning. So you mentioned that you couldn't basically create macros because of the environment you were in, but I probably could have, because I wasn't in an environment that was nearly as well managed and well governed as the environment you were in. And that, I think, is the case of shadow IT. It has been, since client server. Basically, is divisions, groups, even individuals spinning up or sourcing whatever application or platform they kind of wanted that particular week or month or year. And so that might go some ways. There's lessons to be learned from more regulated industries, more structured and controlled environments, that in an agentic world, because the risk of getting it wrong is so much higher, that all organizations need to take it more seriously than maybe many have traditionally done and probably still do.
David, but even then, I just want to add something. It's interesting where Michael was going with that, because it made me think of a event I spoke at a couple of weeks ago, where for the first time on the panel on stage, we actually had a CISO with us. And that was the first time I'd ever seen the CISO on stage. You normally had, to your point, the CDO or the CAIO. But we actually had a CISO, and he was coming on board that this agentic conversation is now bled into his side of the business, and he's being brought into all of those conversations.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it almost has to. Again, I want to save the sort of cybersecurity and the security part of this for like a different show, because I do think we could spend an hour talking about that as well. But the reality is that the entire world around cybersecurity has drastically changed because of agentic AI. And the key point I'll make, and again, argue with me if I'm wrong here, is that in the old days, your cybersecurity was really focused on your periphery, and now it's just everywhere because there's all this activity through MCP, through API access, and I think Salesforce is a good example of this, or some other companies are good examples of this, where like you can come in and out using agents. They're like it's like if your house is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and like you don't know even who's watching the TV in the living room. You're just like, who is that guy and what's he doing here? And did he steal my Doritos kind of thing? Yeah.
Yeah, but on that, it was interesting earlier in the year. I remember talking to a CHRO who was saying, I'm actually taking over AI because, to your point, we're actually giving agents an employee ID in the system. We're mapping out the guardrails ahead of time as to what they can and can't access. And I'm treating them like an employee. I've got to onboard the agent. I've got to give them an employee ID. I've got to monitor them. And then if they go off the rails, I'm going to fire them, shut them down. So it was an interesting take.
This is definitely what we would have done at Goldman Sachs. Yeah.
Right.
Sorry.
Well, and if that's the case, then I suppose the evolution of security, Michael, to your point, away from bigger walls and towards identity, can in theory be applied to agents, right? If an agent is in fact an employee with an ID, then they should be treated with the same restrictions on access, obviously depending on the role that they take on. The challenge, I suppose, is since they are in fact part of the system, if, like the example we talked about from last week, if they have the ability to overwrite their own guardrails or procedures or protocols, then that's an issue. Because that's, back to your point earlier, Michael, that's something that I wouldn't have been able to do and still can't do for myself.
Yeah,
exactly. Well, again, I don't want to talk about autonomy, right? Because we could spend hours on that as well. But like, even when I was a senior manager, even when I was promoted to whatever level I was at Goldman Sachs, like I couldn't just do whatever. I didn't have 100% autonomy, right? So I think this, and we didn't reference that here at all, but I do just want to make this point that like this idea of 100% autonomous agents going out and doing anything, I think is, again, another red herring and a head fake.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's just talk kind of like 35,000 feet. When I look across the region and I look at the report that we were discussing, I feel like some countries are making way more progress. So let's just say moving way faster than others. Are there structural factors across the region that explain this difference, or is it cultural factors? Like, what is driving the fact that Singapore maybe is running really far ahead and some other countries not running as fast?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's a mix of factors. I don't think it's any one thing. I don't think it's any, a particular structural factor, for instance. But I will say, if you look at, certainly within the study, Singapore and Malaysia, both, I think, quite optimistic in terms of their perceptions for AI and in terms of what they're doing, the activities they're taking. And I think part of that, I would absolutely equate it to the ambitions of both of those countries is to get their piece of the AI puzzle, for lack of a better term to use, meaning they're investing heavily in AI factories. Singapore is doing it, in Malaysia and Penang and some other areas they're investing. That means investing in skills as well, and clearly providing an impetus for organizations in those markets to also invest. And I think that has been reflected in the perceptions that came across in the study, in the data, whereas other markets are taking maybe a different approach, or maybe a less ambitious approach. They don't see themselves necessarily as being a hub for AI innovation, the way both Singapore and Malaysia are currently aiming to be.
Yeah, I mean, I did an entire segment, I think it was on Monday, about how Thailand has just approved something like 43 or almost $44 billion of investment. A lot of that is in, I think something like 33 or $35 billion of it was around digital infrastructure and artificial intelligence. Yeah, some countries are moving in ways that other countries are not moving, for sure. David, did you want to comment at all?
No, I mean, I agree from a Boomi perspective. It's interesting. I think English plays a big part of it as well, because a lot of these models are built on the English language, but we're seeing that change more recently. But equally, some of the conversations I have with customers in some of the countries in Southeast Asia, they're still trying to figure out legacy modernization. They're still trying to connect, some bad back-end system into a new SaaS app, let alone think about AI.
Yeah, fair enough. And this gets back to what I was talking about before, right? The pace of things is just changing so
Yeah.
quickly. They're just like catching up to the new thing. It's like, please, can we stop this? Can we just get our cloud infrastructure in place first before
Yes.
and get our data structure in place first before we start doing something else that's really new? Because we know for a fact that something's coming after after AI as well. Can I get both of you guys to comment on this maybe, and then I'll let you go. But like one of the things we said earlier is that at some point the frontier lab model companies are going to run out of data to scrape, right?
Yeah.
And sure, every day new information gets kind of put on the internet, but I think once that process is well understood, whether it's Kimi K3 through Moonshot or ChatGPT through OpenAI, at some point they're all going to have the same data, unless they do go out and get sort of proprietary data from somewhere. But that's like a different story. As those things get commodified, if that's a word, do we feel like the frontier lab models are going to become commodities, and that the value chain for artificial intelligence and the way you can extract money from the value chain is going to come from the services around those businesses as opposed to those
Yes.
businesses themselves? And do you feel like, and again, this may be a little bit controversial, but I don't think so. Do you feel like investing like $1 trillion a year in that is maybe a little bit of an overinvestment?
I don't know if I can speak to the last piece
Yep, fair
because
enough.
now that I'm married and have kids, I no longer invest in penny stocks like I used to. Not that we're talking about penny stocks here, but
Yeah,
the first part of that conversation's really interesting because I'm hearing more and more about forward deployed engineers.
yeah,
That's
FTEs,
becoming a
yeah,
new buzzword, FDEs, because to your exact point, as the models become more commoditized, they've got to look for the next revenue stream, and it's actually
yeah,
embedding their people and businesses to go, hey, we can actually find and design and build and deploy the use case you want using our technology and our model. So
yeah.
we're definitely seeing a lot of that.
Michael.
Yeah, the other thing I'd add, and this might not even be 35,000 feet, might be going higher at this point, but I'm going to come back to sovereignty because there's different
Go
ways to
ahead.
think about it. But it's
Mm.
fascinating to me, and go back to the last massive disruption, let's say cloud, right?
Yep.
Cloud computing is dominated by US based companies, right? All the
Yep.
hyperscale providers. I think with AI and what part of the push for sovereignty is opportunity. A lot of a lot of countries see this as a chance to avoid getting kind of cut out of another 20-year IT cycle and run. And part of that is in the models. So yes, you mentioned the frontier models are moving towards what do you say? Not commodity, maybe standardization, how we say
Yep.
it,
Fair
right?
enough. Yep.
Those are either all in North America again, or a couple in China, right? And that's kind of it. But then you have South Korea, you have India, Thailand with the investments they made. Part of this is
France with
in
Mistral.
Yes, Mistral. Yep.
it's all about creating models that actually aren't quite as standardized, right? Because
Yeah.
they allow for the subtleties and the nuances, the cultural considerations, so they're not as clearly biased towards a particular point of view, culture, what have you. I think that's hugely important. And again, this might not be 35,000 feet, this might be higher, but it's fascinating because that the way that's evolving, it's moving quickly. But I do think there's a bit of an AI arms race, which is about opportunity, not necessarily about threat. There's that side as well.
Yep.
Yeah. Can I ask you guys one more thing and then I'll let you go? Sorry, I know I keep
Sure.
saying this, but it's
I
the
was going to say, you
conversation
already
is too
said that.
interesting for me. Conversation's too interesting for me, and you guys are too good at this. Do you get? I feel like we're in the early innings, and I've definitely said this to David already before, but Michael, for you as well. I feel like we're in the early innings of this. That LLMs are kind of just like our first shot at like how we're going to use artificial intelligence to make our businesses more productive. Bigger, faster, stronger, however you want to define it. Do we see the development of more specified, like vertical, smaller models that don't necessarily need 5 trillion parameters, but maybe just need 1 trillion parameters or a half a trillion parameters that are very specific just to sort of like drug creation or drug research or medical, that type of thing. And then where the models actually become more deterministic and less probabilistic, like do we see development beyond where we are? And what does that look like to both of you?
Definitely one of my predictions for this year is we would go down that specialization route because, again, coming back to that moat, that context for the business, whether it's their business data or the vertical they're in, is
Right.
what their differentiation is. And they're able to then potentially sell that as a service to other businesses. whether and what that will evolve to next, who knows? Because to your point, this is changing so fast. I don't know if Michael, through the analyst side, you've got any more insight on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree. I mean, I generally think about this space and evolution in terms of, you used the point, context. And so
Yeah.
AI in context absolutely would involve a narrow, you just simply don't need a massive LLM
Right.
to do those things. And by the way, just to throw another spanner in the works, we haven't even touched physical AI, which is a whole additional area of focus, and that adds all kinds of spatial considerations and the impact that will have on, you know, our lives and our work and our
Yeah.
productivity. But that's, again, maybe we'll table that. But just wanted to throw that out there. Back to the CD analogy, mate. Things are not slowing down. Certainly not so.
Yeah, I don't want to go the Terminator route or the Matrix
Not
route. We
yet.
can
Let's
definitely
not go
park
there
that
yet.
one.
Oh my God. Okay, gentlemen, you guys have been amazing. I will let you go. Thank you both so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. Michael Barnes, Chief Analyst at Omdia, and David Arecki, CTO APJ at Boomi. You guys were awesome. Thanks again for doing this.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, David.